Hello and welcome back. It's the Monday Morning Show. I'm Ken LaSalle from KenLaSalle.com, and after a bit of a hiatus, DC Home has returned. I'll get to episode 11 in just a moment, but first I wanted to let you know that I am recovering from a pretty persistent cold. It plagued me, sometimes literally, for just about 6 weeks, and I've begun the process of recovery. I'm getting out of the house and walking, and it's nice not to be so cooped up. I also wanted to thank all of the listeners of DC Home. After trying the first 10 episodes, I was very happy to see so many people enjoying it. And now I can announce that the first DC Home compilation will be available on audio and also in ebook format sometime soon. And you'll be able to find it on Audible, iTunes, Amazon, and around the web. And that's it. Those are my announcements. And now, without further ado, well, it's been a quiet week in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. But to be honest, that was only because Sherry Finn no longer had a television. Without the evening news or any feed from any of the 24-hour stations that claim to broadcast news, all of the chaos in the world outside remained in the world outside, while Sherry Finn sat in her bed alone, considering her next move. A lot had happened since February. Sherry could recall the day she officially closed her bar, the bar she had inherited from her sister and her husband after they were killed in one of the many mass shootings that have become a feature on our landscape. That's America. Disneyland, Flint, Michigan, and random death in metal jackets. When Sherry put the final closed sign on the door of her bar, it was like burying her sister all over again. And I wish I could tell you that Sherry was somehow a perfect person through all that. So many people in our stories these days rise above challenges, display the strength of the human heart, tug at your soul just a little bit because they let us know that there's some hope that we may be just the same, able to pull through, immune to the indignities of life. But Sherry was just a waitress who happened to fall on some terrible luck. So when I tell you what became of Sean since the last time we talked, I think you need to understand that there was only so much Sherry could do. She wasn't a mother, had never wanted to be a mother. But she cared enough about Sean to try, even if she failed. So when she pasted that final closed sign, she meant to involve Sean. She knew this was as much a part of his life as it was hers. But she couldn't stop thinking about the government shutdown that had started off this horrible year, and the growing divisions between people who believed in democracy, those who tilted towards dictators and wanted nothing more than to put that orange disgrace on a throne, and the multitudes who were simply too tired, or uneducated, or beaten down, or lost. She thought about how her bar had grown emptier and emptier. She thought about how it didn't matter how much she worked. There were greater forces at work in America, and greater threats to contend with. Sherry launched into a week of furious activity, applying for every job openings she could find. When Sean asked her why Trump was pulling America out of its treaties, starting with our withdrawal from nuclear arms treaties, which had thus far done a decent job at preventing the use of nuclear arms, Sherry didn't have an answer. She kept her nose to the grindstone and kept fishing for that next job. And a week later, when Trump was screaming hate and bigotry and entire loads of irresponsible nonsense, Sherry couldn't explain why a president would divide our country so, why he would preach racism and division and hatred, when we needed a leader to unite us. Sherry told Sean that she'd never seen anything like it. and that surely the Democrats would take some action now that they had control of the House of Representatives. Maybe someone would do something to help people like her, people who were in trouble. But another week passed, and Trump's focus was on this great, big, beautiful wall he wanted to build. And rather than focus on what America needed, the Democrats focused on what Trump wanted. And nothing was done. As March began, Sherry knew they were going to have to move out of their home. The home her sister had once shared. The last tie she had to her sister. But the rent was simply too high. They couldn't afford it. Sherry was already skipping meals, even as she watched the TV Sean always had turned to the news. So she could see Trump standing before a mountain of fast food for a publicity stunt, or because he was too stupid. Most of Trump's actions were due to him being too stupid. She sat with old Herbert and informed him that they were all going to have to move, and that Sherry would not be able to put old Herbert up wherever they landed. But old Herbert was fine with that. His addled old brain was more lucid than normal. He asked her what she planned to do with her things, but she hadn't thought that far. She was too busy being in a panic over being out of work. She didn't qualify for unemployment, and the many counters she had visited in the hopes of finding some kind of support through food stamps or some assistance simply wasn't there. She always had more forms to fill out, more waiting to do, more impossible requirements for a woman who had nothing but responsibilities and no way to meet them. Old Herbert said, "I have room in my storage unit if you'd like to pack away some of your furniture or boxes or clothes." Sherry quickly learned that old Herbert's storage unit was surprisingly real and also surprisingly empty. Old Herbert had once stored his life in there and had pawned off every belonging, every memory, every year of his life, until all he was left with was an empty space the size of a small garage. None of Sherry's belongings went into that garage, because when Sherry tallied up all of her savings, all of her assets, all of the favors she could call in, she couldn't believe how little was left. She took an entire day walking the streets of Georgetown, trying to find an answer to her increasingly dire fate. As luck would have it, she saw Brett Kavanaugh crossing the street, and she ran up and greeted him like a friend. She reminded him of Freedom Fried and all the beers Kavanaugh had never paid for. She didn't want a handout, but she wondered if there was any work she could do. Now, when I tell you that Brett Kavanaugh spit on her, I want you to know that both I and Sherry fully believe there's some reasonable explanation. He must have been talking when the spittle flew, or maybe he was simply trying to, Now, let's face it, he spit on her. That's what Republicans do these days. When they make abortion illegal, when they strike down laws that protect equal pay, when they put women behind bars for seeking asylum, put their children in cages, and threaten to kill every last one of them. Yeah, I think it's fair to say he spit. And that's about when Sherry stopped watching the news. She kept hearing about Mueller's report, which basically served the purpose of reminding us about every sin Trump has committed that we already knew about. Every act of treason he's committed against this nation that we already knew about. every American value he has spit on that, well, you know. While the Democrats, with their voices loud and proud, continue to do nothing for the American people. With every week that passed, they threatened Trump and they postured, and still nothing was done for the American people. Sherry and Sean moved into a motel. Then they moved into a worse motel. Then they moved into a really shitty motel. Jobs were scarce. Sherry stopped waiting to hear back. Every day became more desperate. Sherry tried to make sure Sean had enough to eat. She tried to make sure he made it to school. But she knew she was losing him. She saw less and less of her nephew every week, and she knew less and less about his life. When you lose everything, it becomes harder to hold on to anything. By the time May arrived, everybody knew Trump was a criminal traitor to the United States. But because Mitch McConnell said he wouldn't bring any so-called anti-Trump legislation to the Senate floor, which included any checks and balances, any issues of law, any work for the American people, the Democrats claimed that their hands were tied. The federal government became meaningless as the constitutional crisis laid bare the tumors and stab wounds in our body politic. And none of this helped Washington, D.C., which doesn't function like a state and relied on this federal government for almost everything. Sherry didn't know if any of this answered why the YMCA stopped putting people up, or why the homeless shelters and halfway homes were filled to capacity, or why she couldn't get just a little help. By some miracle, Sherry kept herself and Sean off the streets, and with the month of May, was able to move the two of them into Uno Nomad, a hostel with an elderly host named Greta. Greta was an ancient German émigré who had settled after the Second World War. America had saved her and her parents from the nightmare of post-war Germany after they had lived through the nightmare of World War II. They had been shut away in cages for being different. The government they had supported had turned against them, spitting upon them for their beliefs and their values, and the fact that they were hungry and poor. And now Greta saved Sherry and Sean, putting them up in 2 small rooms on the 2nd floor. Sherry shared a room with 2 other ladies. Sean was also supposed to share his. It wasn't much, but in only 3 months, Sherry and Sean had lost everything. Even old Herbert was gone. Sherry sat on her new bed that night, a bed she wouldn't have considered laying in before 2019. She had stopped crying some time ago. Now her thoughts turned away from Georgetown, away from Washington, away from Trump's America. There had to be somewhere. And that's it from DC, as with the rest of the world. Until next time, be good to yourself, be kind to others, and let's make this world a better place. This is Ken LaSalle, and I just wanted to thank you for stopping by for this episode of DC Home. For more information about myself and the work I do, I invite you to take a look at my website, at kenlasalle.com. You can also find my work on Amazon, Audible, iTunes, and anywhere you find books and audiobooks available online. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube by searching my name, Ken LaSalle. And thank you, as always, for your support.